side.
Okay, so we're going to start on time because we've probably a lot to get through, and then we want to give people a chance to talk as well at the end, so it's not just me and Katie. So I'm Paul, and this is Katie, and we are talking about mediating a role for social justice in the activity of EAP teaching, and the name relates to the theoretical framework that we're going to discuss later on as well, which Katie's going to talk about. So, just to give you a sense of the structure, we're going to start off with the context. Then we're going to give an overview of the research project, because there's two purposes to this. One is to tell the story of what we have learned by trying to situate social justice in an EAP course. And also, we want to report on a BALEAP research project that we did because we got very generous funding, and that's how this was born, though the evolution of it is quite varied in that it's quite difficult to say where it actually started, because it was like a seed just blowing in the wind, and then BALEAP helped the whole thing to flourish. So we're going to talk about the challenges and contradictions that we experienced, and we realized as well when we put that up there, we should also say that there were positives. So we're going to talk about the positives, the challenges and the contradictions. Then Katie's going to talk about the proposed framework, and at that point we'll throw it open to the floor and have some issues for discussion. So the context of this is that now I'm working for UCL, and formerly I was working for the University of Westminster. I was designing and running a pre-sessional program for around 300 students. They were predominantly an East Asian cohort. And so I just had this idea, we were working with the disciplines, and because in my own work and research it's quite interdisciplinary. So I just had this idea of doing something that would reflect more of the work that students were doing in their disciplines and bringing in more of a real world aspect. And because I'm very passionate about social justice in my personal, political, philosophical outlook, everything, I decided, okay, we're going to bring something connected to this into the course. But in the beginning, we weren't quite sure how we were going to do that. And I had this kind of Etienne Wenger communities of practice style idea of just introduce something and let's see how it develops and how it flourishes. So this was the summer of 2021, things were online. So in the Friday sessions, there was a 2-hour session where basically we brought in topics based around social justice into the course. Now, the idea here was that we just hand it over to the teachers and they will take charge of this for themselves, and it'll be pretty clear, and they're going to be interested in this. But it didn't really work out like that. So we realized that something more cultivated was needed. And again, that ties into the way that Wenger's theory has developed as well, because he has moved kind of from the idea of organic communities of practice to more cultivated communities of practice, kind of more Vygotskian. So you need some spark for development. So we decided to focus on the creation of materials, and at the time I had just finished an MA TESOL course where I was working on materials development, and I felt that there is stuff out there by people like Brian Tomlinson and so on, but there's maybe a lack of theory around the production of materials in EAP. So we decided to investigate how we might actually come up with a theory, and at the same time also to make things practical, because we're also very much aware that the teachers we were working with, and that's another issue, because social justice is kind of like an onion almost. You've got all these different layers, and there are questions around the whole justice of expectations regarding teachers who are very often on precarious contracts. They're there for the summer. They don't actually know about the epistemology of the disciplines, as Alex and Ian were talking about earlier on. So out of this, we applied for BALEAP funding, and we got that. And then we began a research project that was quite ambitious, but basically the core idea was just how can we situate social justice and a social justice epistemology in our material design and in our courses in general. So again, I should say that the pre-sessional as well was already based around an academic literacies framework and built around backwards assessment. So the sort of stuff that Jane Pearson writes about, for example, in her work. So I think, Katie, I'll hand it over to you now to talk about the research project itself.
Thank you. Do I need to have the microphone on?
Yes.
Thank you.
Karaoke style microphone.
I think I prefer it more karaoke style. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to go through the research project now, starting off with our research questions. So there were two main research questions. The first one being, what is meant by social justice in EAP teaching and learning context, both locally and globally? And our second research question, looking at how do existing sets of EAP teaching and learning resources incorporate aspects of social justice in both materials and curriculum levels. Now, in order to address the research questions, data was collected using a sequential, exploratory, mixed method design. There were two phases. Phase 1 looked at answering a research question 1, and there were two different data sets there. We had a focus group and also an online survey. The participants were the EAP teachers teaching on our summer pre-sessional course, who were on short-term contracts, but their background was in EFL, and they were early career EAP practitioners who often worked at other institutions throughout the year. So that was phase 1. Phase 2 then looked at sets of materials, and I'm going to highlight 3 that we looked at, although there were lots of other materials. We looked at the EAP, the course materials on our University of Westminster pre-sessional courses. We also looked at, and I have her here today, the BALEAP EAP course by our colleague here, and also the British Council's Climate Connection course. These materials, together with others, were analysed using a template designed by the researchers, which was based on the work of Tomlinson, in line with the community of inquiry model, and it looked to analyse the themes that emerged from the materials. So the results. So with research question 1, what is meant by social justice in EAP teaching and learning context, we'll look first at locally. So we asked our participants to give as much feedback as possible, and they all commented on how there was a linkage between EAP teaching and some of the core values of social justice. So human rights, immigration, child labour, and lots of other topics were mentioned. Definitions varied. Some were not very engaging at all, where we had our most critically engaged definition being, my definition of social justice relates to power imbalances within society, political, financial, cultural, social power, and the interrelationship with factors such as race, gender, sexuality, socioeconomic status, etc. That wasn't my definition, by the way. When we asked the participants whose role was it to teach EAP, although most of them said that they felt confident and comfortable teaching it, there were these more cautious voices saying that actually it's somebody else's responsibility, I don't want to deal with that. And then when we asked them about whether or not it should be incorporated into EAP teaching, there was the general consensus that it actually depends on the principles underpinning the curriculum. So that's locally. Now we look at globally. Now, there was the general consensus that perceptions differ according to the country of origin, where it's being taught, and also the kind of teaching and learning environment. And there was the overarching there was this general agreement that actually certain topics are extremely difficult to talk about. Transgender rights, for example, were highlighted as a topic which make the practitioners themselves self-censor. So there was the general conclusion for research question 1 that in fact most EAP practitioners are advocates of social justice, and there is this general agreement on the necessity of social justice in EAP, but there was some uncertainty as to how theory might relate to practice beyond these ad hoc, context-specific enactments. Let's move on to research question 2 then. So look, we examined our sets of materials with our template in mind, and we wanted to find out whether or not the materials themselves were part of a course or a one-off lesson. We encountered both. Did they meet the needs of the students? Yes, those that were made with EAP learners in mind did meet the needs of the students. Were they informed by a particular theory? And again, those materials that were created with EAP students, learners in mind, were generally informed by academic language acquisition theory and development. So what did the materials consider? They considered the practical needs of the students, so most aimed to prepare students for university life, and this was by incorporating academic skills. Authenticity is important, and we wanted to know whether or not they expose students to real-world language. And yes, but they would need to be adapted to perhaps the language level of the student and where they are on their academic journey. Are they pre-sessional students? Are they undergraduates, postgraduates, or are they doctoral students? Adaptations would need to be made on the way. Was there scope for input and output? Yes. So far we've got a very positive outlook. Other things we looked at were, for example, whether or not they were relevant to wider curriculum. And here we saw that it actually depends on the student's course, and that special mention would need to be made of the student's disciplines to tie it in with the questions that were being asked. We thought about the long-term benefits, and we found that the materials, yes, there were these long-term benefits, but again with these adaptations, with the level, thinking about the journey and also the discipline. What about the shortcomings? Now, we found that only a few of the materials out there include discursive elements, which is a little bit alarming, given that sometimes at university students are asked to write discursive essays, asked to be critical, and so therefore, again, perhaps another adaptation would be needed. So the general conclusion here was that yes, most address issues of social justice in one-off lessons, not throughout the curriculum, and that they would need to be adapted. Okay, over to Paul, who's going to be talking about some of the challenges that we faced. You've got that one.
Right.
Okay.
So hopefully this one's working. So yeah, I mean, again, the terms challenges and contradictions, that goes back to activity theory, and they're not intended as negatives, as I said. So these are just some of the issues that we encountered in terms of looking at how you integrate social justice into an EAP course, such as a pre-sessional. It'll be different in other contexts and other courses, and I'm aware that everyone sort of works in a different context. But I think in terms of pre-sessional courses, I think, and you saw that in some of the responses. I mean, that was only a snapshot of what people were saying. There were more detailed responses, which you can see in a chapter that Katie and some of her colleagues have actually written for a forthcoming publication. But anyway, one of the main contradictions was in the way that we assess students, and I think this is something that goes to the heart of the whole idea about how do we decolonize, how do we integrate social justice into our curriculum, into our materials, into everything we do. And I think it kind of has to start at that level of assessment and even the backwards assessment process. And Jan McArthur has written quite extensively about this, and Jane Pearson as well, in more of an English language teaching or EAP context. So at the minute, there is this mismatch in the way that EAP students are assessed. And again, Jan McArthur would say throughout the entire university, there is this mismatch where we're policing students. And that is especially true on pre-sessional courses, where we're still basing everything around the deficit model. And that's one of the things yesterday, I mean, in room 101, the first thing that I would banish into room 101 would be the deficit model approach, because then you get rid of a whole other associated series of things. Now, moving on from that, again, there was a whole issue about the actual activity of EAP teaching, and finding a synergy between these topics and the focus of pre-sessional courses. So again, what has this got to do with EAP? I mean, we're basically assessing these students to, at the end of the day, to come out with a set of equivalences to IELTS, whatever way we dress that up. So we're like gatekeepers. So do they need to know about Black Lives Matter or environmental issues, or do they need to know about refugee issues or whatever? I mean, some teachers actually say, no, I don't want to be involved in this. And of course, then the justice of pre-sessionals themselves, because I talked about social justice being like an onion, and we have to just consider why pre-sessionals exist. And again, in room 101 yesterday, there was quite a good discussion, which probably could have gone on for hours actually. Is there another way of delivering pre-sessionals that is more just to staff and to students? And again, a lot of these challenges and contradictions are reflected in the idea of the social justice epistemology in itself. I mean, what is social justice? What does it mean? And I've been working on a book with Breen Le Roux here, and as I said, Katie and Averill here, several people, and Kashmir, and Alex. So
Anyone else?
Lots of people have written chapters. Okay, but social justice epistemologies differ in different contexts, and even actually Jan McArthur has written a chapter for me as well. She says she hates the word epistemology because she thinks it's pretentious and colonial. But even one situation, for example, in Qatar, one of the authors was writing about Qatar and was questioning whether or not it's socially just to try and enforce Western perspectives on social justice and on a whole set of issues that the Qatari students really struggle to grasp. Okay, and so there are so many divisions. It's a very fragmented and fractured landscape, and I would actually say it's kind of like a reincarnation of imperialistic divisions. And Alex Ding gave a talk at EAP in Ireland in 2019, and he spoke about how identity politics in some ways could actually be a tool of neoliberalism by keeping causes divided rather than seeing them unite. So, it's important not to just concentrate on or just to look at the negatives. So we need to think about how we can address these issues. So, one way in which I think teachers and designers brought a sense of social justice to bear in practical terms, because at the end of the day, that's what this is about. We want to give you something that you can take away and use in your own practice. And you saw one of the quotes from someone about how you've got to integrate all of these things together into almost like a single worldview, in that you've got to think about not just cultural justice, but again also socioeconomic justice. And John Gray from UCL, for example, he writes quite widely about this. So in that sense, I used this image to kind of capture a sense of that, and it's of a guy called Mark Ashton, who was responsible for forming an LGBT support group during the miners' strikes. And again, I think that's a very good example of how people and different people and different causes can come together because of a shared worldview around fairness and justice and so on, and can work together and synergize and harmonize that. And again, you know, another thing in using that example, Katie Shaw up in the University of Northumbria writes, from an English literature perspective, I mean, she's talked about how our perspective on the miners, we generally think of them as men, but actually the miners' strikes also affected women. So I think this was a good example of how you can look at things from the perspective of various stakeholders, all kind of, well, that's probably a wrong word, but various groups and ideas kind of coming together in a shared landscape rather than keeping things divided. And, you know, what's important as well, because we often get criticized about, you know, woke pedagogy and things like that. But, you know, at the end of the day, it's not about people having to agree 100% with everything. It's about supporting things in a fair way and about encouraging awareness of these things and you know, giving students an awareness of issues. And I mean, one way in which this again works in practice, at Westminster a couple of years ago, we had a transgender colleague who spoke to a group of East Asian students about the history of LGBT and transgender groups in the UK. And actually what was interesting there is that afterwards, many of the Chinese students were coming to us and were coming to me and were saying, you know, we actually had a very different perspective on that. And, you know, we were told X about these people, but actually that's different to the reality. So maybe then if we think about that, there are other things in our society that we might question. And then you try and, because again, China was a colonized society, for example, so we could talk at length about that. But you then try to move that towards criticality in their disciplines. So you take an awareness of something like that being used to foster that kind of greater awareness of these causes and the need for criticality and how they can trigger questioning and critical thinking and so on in specific subjects. So anyway, we then, the end result of all of this, so we're kind of moving a bit quickly, but we have to, Katie and the others involved in this came up with a theoretical framework and an adaptation of an activity theory framework for this. So.
Okay, so I'm going to talk through our proposed framework. So in addition to the 2 research questions that I've already given you the results for, we also wanted to come up with a framework. Now, we looked at when looking for a framework, we considered Jorge Reyna's digital teaching and learning ecosystem model. We looked into the community of inquiry model by Anderson. We then considered and decided to use activity theory. Now, why? Why did we use activity theory? Because it can be seen as a lens to analyse human activity. It's a framework that is used to confront deep social transformations, which Paul's already commented on. And from an epistemological perspective, it acknowledges that social interaction facilitates learning, and that learning is situated within a specific context. So it's ideal for circumstances that are dealing with which are undergoing fast and ongoing change. So with that in mind, with its messiness and its constant changing, activity theory was reworked. So Engelstrom's activity theory was reworked. And I'm going to explain it now As you know, as you probably all know, activity theory is seen in the form of a triangle. In our framework, we have the element of activity theory as follows. I'm going to start at the bottom right-hand side of the triangle. Here we have our division of labour, and this refers to the EAP departments and the curriculum leads that are working, and also the writing material, the material writers. We then move up to the top of the triangle with our mediating artefacts. This is the overarching EAP curriculum and the materials themselves, which are used as a vehicle to input the topics of social justice. We then go down to the bottom left-hand side of the triangle and we have the rules. Now, the rules were considered having analysed the results from our findings, and we said that first of all, appropriacy needed to be considered. Appropriacy in the sense of the language covered, and asking the materials writers questions like, for example, what additional support might need to be prepared, so that the students can ask questions about the content, that they can express different viewpoints and negotiate. The second rule is relevance. Relevance of the language and also the subject matter content, having considered the audience. So remember, we talked about the audience being, for example, is it pre-session or undergraduate, etc. So asking questions, for example, is the material of a suitably academic standard for the level of the students? Does the material address a social justice topic in sufficient detail? Thinking also about from what perspective. As Paul said, people have very different perspectives on things. And from what bias, for example? Are there any issues that should be considered or avoided, and why? The third rule being the purpose, and the purpose of the material and the accompanying task, and the question thinking about, can this material and task actually give practice of a relevant language aim, or any other conventions of academic English, which the students will require at the specific level. And then, does the material enable students to think critically and ask questions about the social justice topic? Okay, so having looked at the 3 points of the triangle, we then move on to the community. So the community is everybody. So we've got our institutions, our EAP departments, our students, and our EAP practitioners. Let's go to the middle of the triangle, and we have here our subject, which are the EAP practitioners. And then who are obviously teaching on this EAP course. The object, which is the vehicle used to, the materials themselves, which are used as a vehicle to incorporate these themes of social justice. And the outcome, we've decided that the outcome should be awareness of the topic from various different perspectives. So our hope is that by discussing areas of social justice and equipping the students with the language that they need to exchange views in an academic context, students will be able to think critically about these issues, ask questions, and take more active roles if they choose to do so. Okay, so that's a brief overview of our framework. Paul's going to talk a little bit about the materials that we created off the back of the framework.
Yeah, so I think I developed that framework further then, because I think what the materials revealed and what the whole project showed is, I think this works best again when you have that kind of, I don't want to use the word epistemology again, but when you have like that overview or that infusion of an emphasis on social justice, kind of, I would say, growing. I used the image of seeds at the beginning. So social justice is like the thing that nourishes the design of the materials, or the design of the course, design of the assessment, and so on. So within the materials, we saw that working best when people were finding some kind of synergy between things, and when they were comparing issues. And again, like the example that I used, when the materials were used as more of a prompt for the students then to actually apply these to their own contexts and their own disciplines, and to get them thinking critically, almost without thinking, so it becomes kind of subconscious again, like the Vygotskian idea. You know, it's like a trigger for development, and we saw in that again, when teachers had that kind of coherent sense of what they were doing with social justice, then that's as well when they felt most comfortable, you know, dealing with this, in that, you know, they're not teaching these things as topics in themselves. They are using those topics as a kind of vehicle for something else. And so again, there's more on the adapted framework. Again, I'm not trying to flog the book because it's not even published yet. But anyway, there is more on this framework in the book that I have edited, and I wrote I wrote the introduction and the conclusion. But that has kind of been like a whirlwind tour of something that, you know, really spans 2 years. So we have maybe gone a little bit over time. But we did have some issues for discussion. And again, just in terms of social justice infusing everything, you know, social justice should also kind of infuse our pedagogy as well, because it's not about social justice replacing existing pedagogies, or social justice replacing an emphasis on language. Like sometimes in certain some articles, you see this almost clash between critical EAP and, you know, those who would say that EAP should come from a more text-based focus. So this is about how do we make social justice more a part of our practice? And the example I was going to use is in my own teaching, what I do now, because breakout rooms, for example, I got so many different reactions and responses with those. I always tend to ask the students whether or not they want something at whole class level or breakout rooms. So I was going to kind of do something similar here, but we probably haven't even time, so we'll have to do this. Rather than discussing these questions at this stage, because we've only got, I think, we've got 8 minutes. 8 minutes. So has anybody got any particular response to the talk, or any questions, or any ideas around these questions? I mean, we would be really interested just to learn about people's attitudes to this whole idea of, like, you know, infusing EAP with more of a sense of social justice. Yeah.
I'm interested in the teachers that you were working with, I guess, because I tried this and kind of integrated it as a way of developing a student's argumentative skills and critical thinking skills and stuff, and trying to create a space so that they can do that. And what I found is that the issue doesn't seem to be the students' engagement, it seems to be the teachers' resistance to being in a space where they don't know what they're going to come back with, and they don't know what they're allowed to say. So I don't know if that's been an issue for you guys, but that's been an issue for me.
Definitely has been an issue. It has. I mean.
And how do you deal with that?
Yeah.
How do you convince them they're allowed to talk?
Yeah, I think that when we give our training session on the pre-sessional, we say that, you know, that you are expected. This is part of the curriculum. This is something that you're going to take on board, and we do have like buddy systems so that they can team up with someone if they're not comfortable teaching something or talking about something. They can discuss with them, or they can come and talk to us. It does happen. There was a lot of resistance from perhaps 2 of the teachers out of the 18. But we have managed to convince them.
Were they newer, or were they existing,
I think,
very long-standing teachers?
New teachers.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Maybe the opposite to my love.
Yeah. But it was just, but for example, perhaps the participant that said it's not my responsibility would be that.
Yeah, it's like, it's not my thing. It's not
Yeah. I'm an EAP teacher. I don't do this.
I think as well, one thing that we've been talking about at UCL recently, the idea of brave spaces as opposed to safe spaces. So, you know, just give students, I think it's Arau and Clemens 2013 wrote the first article about this, and it's like the idea that you create spaces where people can speak up and where a range of views are allowed and that sort of thing. But yeah, it is a challenge.
So I was just thinking.
Teachers feel the need to teach, and so if they're in a space where they can't.
But it also works the other way around, because we had our pre-sessional last year it was all online, and when we started rolling out the materials, our students who were in Asia, they were just silent, and because they didn't want to speak out. And then when we met the students in person, they were fine. But I think that they have that kind of lack of confidence to speak out online about topics that are so drastic for them, for example.
And also that we're not, also to create that sense in the classroom, once again comes back to decolonising, that the Western-centric view, or our view as Western educators, if you like, doesn't necessarily have to be it's not the dominant voice in the classroom in these discussions. It's kind of a partnership, so creating that sort of atmosphere, and then
But for example, that's why awareness was is the outcome, because we found with our pre-sessional students, we talked about Black Lives Matter and they had no idea. They were like, what's this?
I've been trying to bring in more sustainability into classes, now trying to get it at a more course of curriculum level. What I've heard from people is that it's a great step forward if you can then get that into assessment criteria.
Yeah.
But that can be quite difficult because you don't necessarily have the power to influence them. Have you had any experience with this, with using bringing social justice issues into the actual assessment criteria?
So I can talk about it. So on our in-sessional at Westminster, for example, this year we've reworked all the materials and then they're all surrounding the Sustainable Development Goals. And so we're looking at exactly this, incorporating academic skills, and then when we come to the assessment, we ask the students to write an essay which is linked to their discipline, and they choose one or two of the Sustainable Development Goals. So they evaluate or they say which one their discipline could have a greater effect on, or what their discipline is doing towards that. So then that's the way that we've done incorporated the SDGs, but also in terms of a presentation as well.
Right.
So exploring about which one's more beneficial for them as a person, and which one's more beneficial for their discipline. So that's one way you could do it.
Paul, thank you. Can I just say yes? That first one question, do you need to see a greater sense of social justice? I would say yes. At all levels. It's not as an add-on, but more kind of where you're habituating it in your everyday life. Similarly with decolonising, sustainability, and it's all kind of part of the bigger picture. And it's just what this lady here was saying about the teachers being a little bit uncertain, not knowing how to react to it. But we live in a world of uncertainty. You know, after COVID, we're in that mindset. So you need to be open to these uncertainties. And as you said, it's kind of learning at the same time as the students, and co-constructing meaning, or trying to find a way out of this, or kind of, address it together instead of being afraid of it, I think.
Yeah, and I really like that word, habituation. I should have used that one.
Sorry?
I like that word, habituation.
Oh, yeah. I said that about decolonising.
Yeah.
Right. So I think
Sure. Yeah. So I feel like I had a lot to say, but there's no time. So
You've got 1 minute. Quick.
Fantastic. So in my program, I teach a foundational program at the University of Toronto, and we've sort of embraced critical multiculturalism and critical race theory to basically as a lens to plan our course. It's a reading and writing course, and I think I'll just speak about assessment because it's also been, I'm talking about in our talk at 2 o'clock. What we do is we have a research paper that the students do, and we have them research and equity seeking or human rights seeking group as part of a year-long research paper, and understanding the needs of this group in higher education. And so they learn about like racism, they learn about mental health issues, and they learn about this. And then they're tasked with understanding how the universities, based on their